Hello and welcome to another episode of the Finrestra podcast. I am Jan.musschoot. Because this is the first episode of February, here's a quick recap of the financial news of January 2022. ALD, the leasing subsidiary of Société Générale, acquired lease plan for 4.9 billion euro. In Italy, the state fund that controls troubled bank Carige has picked BPER Banca to negotiate a sale of Carige. Belgian private bank De Groof Petercam sold its Swiss subsidiary to Gonnet & Company. The European Central Bank launched its 2022 climate stress test. The results will be published in July. Finally, euro area inflation rose to 5.1% in January 2022. And inflation is once again the topic of today's episode of the Finrestra podcast. So, because what I want to discuss is what is causing the current inflation and what role does the European Central Bank have, or what role could it play? So, before we dive into the options for the European Central Bank, we should establish some facts first. So in the euro area, probably unlike the United States, but in Europe, inflation is mainly driven by energy costs. So of the 5% inflation in January, about 3%, so more than half, is due to energy prices of households. And if you look into detail in the reports of Eurostat, which measures inflation, they estimate that energy expenditure of households is about 11% of total consumption. And so energy prices have gone up about 30% compared to a year ago. So that explains the majority of the inflation that we're witnessing. And if you listen to central bankers, they mostly say that the current inflation that we are experiencing is beyond their control. So of course, the majority of energy that we consume in Europe is imported, so we are dependent on international energy markets. And they say, well, the European Central Bank cannot, for example, change the price of oil and gas. Like, for example, you have Isabel Schnabel, the German central banker. She gave an interview with a German newspaper, and she literally says that monetary policy cannot reduce the price of oil and gas. That's like a literal quote from that interview with Süddeutsche Zeitung. Now, this seems to be true if you're thinking about conventional monetary policy. But here in this episode, I want to do three more radical proposals, or maybe especially the first two are radical. The third is more plain vanilla and can be easily implemented by the ECB within their current mental framework and their the toolbox that they currently use. So let's get into the first proposal. The first proposal was actually something that I put out on Twitter already in 2022, because the ECB has these listening events. Of course, because of the pandemic, it couldn't be in real person, but you could tell them with the hashtag ECB listens, or you could submit your proposal on the ECB website. And I actually proposed that the European Central Bank would use the low stock prices of oil and gas companies to buy a majority stake in companies like Shell or Total or some other oil and gas companies. And my original proposal was buy these companies, and then because you control the majority of it, you're the major shareholder, you could for example, tell them, you're no longer going to use shale gas or explore Arctic or Antarctic oil projects. But if the ECB would be the major shareholder now of fossil fuel companies, in this period where oil majors and gas companies make a lot of profits because of the high prices, you could actually force the companies to forgo a lot of these profits and sell them at lower prices. So actually, as the major shareholder, the European Central Bank could force lower oil and gas prices. So unlike what Isabel Schnabel said in that interview, I do believe that the European Central Bank could in fact force companies to reduce their prices for their European customers. I don't want to go into all of the details, but I think that like the French president also forced like the state-owned companies, or at least the French energy companies where they have a lot of, or where they are still a significant shareholder, to also like freeze their prices. And that's one of the reasons why France has lower inflation now than, for example, Belgium or Germany. Of course, this is a quite radical proposal, but if you look back, so I'm looking at my tweet here, it was the 30th of October of 2020. So yeah, oil and gas majors were trading very cheaply. And especially now that stock prices have recovered, the ECB has really wasted an opportunity, both for climate reasons and also for price stability, to acquire a significant stake in these companies. And if you think in terms of QE, so the asset purchase program, the ECB invests or buys like billions of euros of government bonds every month. If instead they would just have bought shares of Total and Shell and other oil and gas companies, now they would be in a much better position to change the price of oil and gas, and also to like have lower inflation right now. So that's a quite radical proposal, I agree. The second proposal is more conventional, but would need a new company. So this is a proposal I already did in 2017. So I'm really feeling old right now reading this back, but I think my proposal still makes a lot of sense. So what was the proposal? It's hard to imagine now, but just before the pandemic and even during the pandemic, we were not suffering from high inflation. But the problem for years was that inflation was too low compared to the European Central Bank's target, which was at the time before the strategy review was below but close to 2%. So if you want to learn more about the strategy review, you should listen to our first episode with Uri Batsagan from Positive Money Europe. But so the problem had been for years that inflation was too low. And my proposal at the time in 2017 was, the European Union should create something that I called in that paper the European Green Infrastructure Company. And the idea was that this company would do all kinds of energy efficient investments in Euro area countries. So for example, they could build energy efficient schools, or they could install like a charger network for electric vehicles, or install rooftop solar panels and all those kinds of solutions for renewable energy. And you can imagine like what does this have to do with the ECB? Because I'll put a link in the description of the podcast. But if you want to Google it, the title of the paper was Green Infrastructure Bonds with Macro Strings Attached: How the ECB could fulfill its mandate by fighting climate change. So, and what does this energy investments have to do with the European Central Bank? So, because the euro area is quite heterogeneous, so inflation can be higher or lower in different countries, the energy company, the European Green Infrastructure Company, would do a lot of investments in countries where inflation is below the ECB's target, because below the target indicates that the inflation the economy is not overheated. In the contrary, so there are a lot of unused resources. Like there are a lot of people who want to work, and there's also not a lot of demand for industrial goods. So by first investing in the countries with low inflation, there would be a whole infrastructure built, and then maybe after a while, like the economy starts heating in, for example, in Slovakia, but then there could be like lower economic activity in Germany, and then the European Green Infrastructure Company could shift some of its workers and investments to Germany. And what does this have to do with the European Central Bank? So the idea was that the European Central Bank would actually finance this company, and then depending on inflation, they could like augment or lower their bond buying. So it was quite detailed proposal. And yeah, if you want to learn the details, check the description of this podcast episode. But of course, this is something longer term. If we or if the European Union had set up something like this already years ago, then we would be much less reliant on imported fossil fuels, and also inflation would be lower than the 5% that we're experiencing right now. So this is all water under the bridge. Of course, we know that in real life they didn't set up this company. And Europe has actually wasted almost a decade where they could become energy independent from Russia or from other countries who we buy energy from. So, but now we are here in 2022, and inflation is high, and there are a lot of calls for raising interest rates. So the typical solution of central bankers is like inflation is too high. This means that demand is too high, and so by raising interest rates, the central bank would make it more attractive for people to save their money, so not to spend it and not to use the scarce real resources. But of course, so it's not really obvious that this is the solution right now, because by increasing interest rates, you will also make it slightly more expensive to invest in, for example, thermal isolation of your home or your apartment. And energy is what's driving inflation right now. So actually, the European Central Bank would want to see investments that reduce our dependence on especially fossil fuel or fossil energy. So this brings us to the third proposal, or the third tool that the European Central Bank could use right now, and that's actually lowering the interest rate. And yeah, this might seem a bit contradictory, because inflation is high, so you would expect interest rates to be higher. But the European Central Bank could lower interest rates, but only for loans related to renewable energy or energy efficiency of buildings. So, and what that would do would it would kind of tilt the playing field. So investments for energy efficiency will become cheaper, while other investments or loans for consumption would become more expensive. And so this will probably result in, of course, high energy prices make it more attractive now to do these investments, but by lowering interest rates, to, for example, minus 5%, the ECB would make it even more attractive for people who are still hesitating or don't have enough money saved to make investments to make their homes more energy efficient. But by offering these very low interest rates, more people would make the choice to make these investments. And so because there would be more demand, the factories that produce building materials and also workers who do the installation of these like for example solar panels or extra insulation or better windows that are better isolated. So people and companies, they would invest more in energy solutions and less in other consumption. So the ECB could simultaneously lower its interest rates for the things that it considers bottlenecks, so the drivers of the current inflation, and then they could slow down the rest of the economy or stimulate a shift in resources from non-bottleneck sectors into these energy investments that we need right now. And so you could say like, but isn't this a problem that the European Central Bank cannot do industrial policy? Yeah, that's true, but central bankers like Isabel Schnabel have argued for a while that we are seeing a too slow transition to a net zero emission economy in Europe, and that's a market failure. And the European Central Bank, within the treaties, should guarantee an efficient allocation of resources. And so it shouldn't just fund the status quo. So if it identifies a market failure, it could use its interest rates to correct the market failure. So basically, these are three proposals for the European Central Bank, where it can actually influence energy prices. So they shouldn't just throw their hands in the air and say like, oh yeah, the current inflation is beyond our control or we cannot do anything. So the first two proposals were quite radical. So you'll remember that the first proposal was that they could have bought energy companies, and then as the major shareholder, they could like say, oh, we don't want all of these profits. Like we want you to sell your gas and your oil cheaper to European customers. So I agree that's probably too radical for conservative central bankers. The second proposal was Europe or the EU could have set up a green infrastructure company where they make investments in renewable energy and building efficiency. And that could be funded by the European Central Bank. So the European Central Bank could have bought the bonds of this company. That's also something that the European Central Bank cannot do on its own. So there you would need a lot of coordination with, for example, the European Commission and with European Parliament to set this up. But the third proposal is something that's been around in under different names, like green teltros, for example. And so there the idea is basically that the ECB lowers the interest rates for energy efficient investments, while if it wants to slow down inflation, it could still increase its interest rates for all other purposes. So if the purpose is, if you take out a loan just to buy a house but not to renovate, then maybe your borrowing costs would go up a little more to slow down the economy, or if you want to borrow money for some other expenditure, then your interest rates would also go up. But if you're really investing in something that makes our economy less reliant on fossil fuels, then the ECB could reduce that interest rate. And this would also fit very nicely, not just within its primary mandate of price stability, because it would reduce our dependence on imported inflation, but also would be good for climate change. So you'll remember that Lagarde has talked a lot about climate change and the role of the European Central Bank. Now this would be like killing two birds with one stone. So by lowering interest rates for energy efficient investments, they would speed up the transition to a net zero emission economy and also reduce or lower the inflation that we are experiencing now. And then in the long run, so say like over 5 or 10 years, the fraction of expenditures of European consumers on fossil fuels would be drastically lower. And even if some years from now fossil energy goes up a lot in price again, if this energy is only like, for example, 2 or 3% in consumer expenditures, then even very steep increases in the price will only have a modest effect on consumer prices. So I hope that the European Central Bank is listening now. And as always, if you want to discuss these proposals or if you have any other suggestions for how the European Central Bank could deal with the current inflation, you can always find me on Twitter. That's at jan.musschoot, at jan.musschoot. Or you can also mail me at jan.musschoot@finrestra.com. So this has been our first episode of February. We will be back in 2 weeks with an interview, and I cannot tell you the guest yet, but the topic is also on the European Central Bank, because my guest has written a very nice report on the responsibilities of the European Central Bank. So as always, thank you so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Finrestra podcast. We'll be back in 2 weeks. See you.